So today I'm going to be talking about black hats and white collars. This is some research that I did, really looking through a lot of actual criminal complaint documents. It's actually, I found that those documents are actually really great for threat intelligence. You can actually start to learn a lot about folks that are criminal hackers, what they're using for infrastructure and things like that. And this particular topic I found really interesting because we always talk about how much money that hackers can make, doing stolen credit cards, things like that. But there's actually a lot more money to be made when you're actually looking at doing stock trades and things like that. And I'll kind of walk through, how they actually conducted some of those particular breaches. About me, I'm based in Portland, Oregon. I work for a company called Splunk. It's kind of my dream job. I get access to large sets of data. And I get to do all sorts of fun things. I teach workshops around threat hunting, how to go and actually find adversaries in your environment when your automated boundary defenses fail. I'm also very interested in insider threat. At our user conference, I'll actually be talking about how to leverage machine learning for looking at insider threats. So if you guys are coming to conf, if you're a Splunk customer, I'll see you there. But prior to my work at Splunk, I actually developed various tools to help track stolen devices. And when I did that, I actually ended up also unveiling large organized crime rings. A stolen laptop, for example, would basically function as a Trojan into various Russian organized crime groups that were in Portland, for example. And so I learned a lot about sort of investigative theory and process around that. Worked really closely with the FBI and law enforcement in a lot of those investigations. So the cool thing is that I've actually put people in jail with data. Right, so that's kind of where I've done a lot of presentations around this. I actually presented at DEF CON around that topic as well. But I really kind of go down rabbit holes. I look at particular types of attacks, and I try to unveil how the attackers actually went about and committed their crimes. So why this topic? I think this is really interesting because it involves criminal hacking. It also involves fraud, insider trading, insider threat. I'm going to go through a lot of these different cases, and you'll see all these different components. Sometimes we think of securities, it's your boundary defenses, your firewalls, and things like that. But what I've found is, particularly when you're conducting investigations, a lot of times you have to bring in other different types of data sources. You may even need to get data sources from another service provider. We'll see that with one of the breaches where a PR firm, like a newswire, they didn't actually protect their information. They didn't have the right logs in place. So the FBI, when they came in to ask for those logs, they didn't have them. And that made the investigation quite a bit difficult. So a lot of times when you're talking about the data that you need, it's not always just for your immediate investigations. It might be required for other types of investigations, depending on your industry. This also involves some things around using dark nets and Tor. There's a lot of international things that happen. I actually found a lot of collaboration with hackers that are in the Ukraine and Russia, actually collaborating with white-collar criminals. And actually people that are, one guy was actually a VP at Morgan Stanley, and he was actually leveraging some of these hackers to actually go out and do some of this dirty work. And I'll talk about how those guys met as well. And this type of attack is really difficult to detect. You'll see in a lot of these cases, the reason these guys got caught is because they got greedy, they're arrogant, or someone just made a stupid mistake. And I think if you actually look at some of these, I think there's a lot more of this going on than we would like to admit. The SEC is involved in some of this, and even the SEC themselves have been hacked, and I'll talk about that as well. But there's a lot of money to be made, and I think there's a lot of money being made as a result of these types of compromise. And I'm still conducting additional research. I'm actually in some of the darknet forums where I'm actually looking at some of these folks that are actually trading this information. I'm hoping to unveil some of that at Black Hat next year. So we always think about who's targeting an organization. I always like to think about the tools, tactics, and procedures. Depending on our industry, right, we can look at, hey, if we have intellectual property, that's going to be a target of an organization. If we have credit cards, if we have customer information that can be sold, that's all valuable information for a hacker. So when we start to do our threat modeling, it should be around that based on our industry. But there's other types of information. If you're a publicly traded company and you have earnings reports, that data can be incredibly valuable to the right people who know how to make money off of it. And you'll see that in our example. One group actually generated over $100 million in trades. The SEC was able to recover about 53 million of that. So one guy in particular, he's going to jail for 20 years, but for about 4 or 5 years, he lived a pretty good life. And it's always good to think about this in your log sources and things like that, the data sources that you actually have in your environment. And you'll see in a lot of cases, you need more than just firewalls and VPN, things like that. A lot of times, very sophisticated malware can be put on systems, so you're going to need really high fidelity logs from your endpoint. So I found actually a lot of folks in the financial industry are actually becoming really interested in cryptocurrency, right? Especially Bitcoin and things like that. They're actually trading on this themselves. And with that, what's happened is a lot of these folks have become a little bit more technically savvy. They're actually leveraging Tor, they're going into darknet forums, and they're actually meeting hackers, right? So what's happening is these guys have really good knowledge around finance. They know how to do white-collar crime, and they're meeting with these hackers who have really nice technical chops. So what happens is they're paying the hackers to go out and hack some of these systems and get access to some of this information, and then they're giving that information to the traders. And the traders are either just giving them straight up Bitcoin for that, is really difficult to trace, or in some cases they're even setting up trading accounts for those hackers so that they can make money as well. And you'll see that. And these guys, so one case in particular, they got really, really greedy, and that's really how they got caught, because there was a lot of irregularities that were being detected. I really like this show, Billions, so it talks a lot about this kind of stuff, right? How to get some of the information, if you guys have ever watched the show. I like Paul Giamatti too, but they do talk about some of these types of scenarios as well. And it's just amazing how much money these folks can actually make. So the definition of insider trading, so it's the illegal practice of trading on a stock exchange to one's own advantage through having access to confidential information. It's a little bit deeper than that too. What's interesting is that when we start looking at hackers accessing information, it's a little bit different because it actually doesn't, originally it wasn't actually classified as insider trading. They actually developed a term called outsider trading because a hacker who has access to information does not have a fiduciary duty around that information, right? He's not an officer. He's not maybe a family member of someone that might have access to some of that information, right? They're actually conducting crimes. So a lot of times folks will actually get sentenced for crime, but they won't get sentenced to insider trading. But there was actually a change that was made when one of these cases actually came to light. So this is the SEC versus a fellow named Dorozoko, and I'm going to totally brutalize Ukrainian and Russian names, so I apologize in advance. This fellow, he was a hacker. There was some interesting things that happened. He actually was trading with this particular trading company. They're called Interactive Brokers. He put out about $42,000 in there, and he made around almost $300,000 in one trade. He was really not too smart because he just opened that account, and this was his first transaction, right? And of course, that's going to throw some red flags. His account got suspended while the Interactive Brokers conducted the investigation and contacted the SEC. So what was actually happening is that he was doing reconnaissance. He was actually targeting one particular company. And a lot of times when companies, when they have to announce their earnings, they would provide this information to Thomson Financial. They would have slides. Excuse me, this would be maybe a day or so in advance. They would have the system all set up, and then they would actually conduct their presentation, and then, of course, the stock price would change as a result of that earnings report. So he was doing some initial reconnaissance. He was able to actually do brute force the credentials of a particular person from this one company. He was then able to intrude at around 2:15, and he was actually exfiltrating that earnings and the non-public information. So what happened was, again, this IMS Health Incorporated company, they published that information to this particular server, and he was waiting for it. He got access to it. He knew what folder it was going to be and what directory, and so he just sat there and he waited. He kept looking for it, and then when it actually got landed, he pulled the data down, and then that's where we actually see that he was conducting his trades, and that's how he got busted. So, summary judgment, he had to pay back that money plus the interest, right? He actually never appeared in court because he's in the Ukraine. He did not owe fiduciary duty to the source of the information or those persons with whom he had transacted in the market. So the court determined that he was not liable for insider trading at the time. So the SEC actually modified the definition of insider trading so that if another case like this did appear, it would get covered under insider trading. So now they have actually called this particular term outsider trading. Yeah. So another one, this was actually, a group of hackers got really smart. They actually targeted PR firms. You know, when you're a public traded company, you get your press releases ready, you're going to announce your earnings, you send that out. That's another awesome target if you're looking for this type of information. And this is where we actually found like folks that were communicating via darknets. There was a lot of other investors involved. This particular case, that actually these guys were doing these trades up to, it was actually past 2014, almost into 2015. The hackers, one of the guys was named Vadim Ilomovich. Again, I'm brutalizing these names. So what happened was he got busted in the Ukraine for stolen credit cards. When they actually went, they got his system, and the FBI got access to that as well. When they were working with the Ukraine police, that's when they actually discovered this particular scheme. They would not have known that these guys were doing this unless that one guy, he did something stupid. He was doing stolen credit cards and things like that. And these guys made over like $50 million. So these are the hackers, and then there's a Dubovoy group. So there's a number of people that were actually part of this. There were 35 different people that were involved in these trades. They're all over the world. These guys were financial wizards. One of these guys, he was actually a former VP at Morgan Stanley. So the hackers, the way they worked, the first target they went after was this one particular PR like newswire called MarketWired. They did a SQL injection, and they were able to install reverse shells. And then they were able to access various internal login credentials. They were able to escalate their privileges fairly quickly. For looking at some of the stuff with MarketWired, they weren't logging a lot of the information. I was actually trying to dig deeper into this and really reading into some of the criminal complaints. So that raised some challenges as well. But luckily, a lot of that information was on one fellow's computer, and that's how they were able to use that as evidence. They downloaded over 100,000 press releases, right? That's what they did. And then what they did is they uploaded them. They actually created a hidden like service. They uploaded them to a website, and then they went on these various criminal hacker forums, and they advertised their access. And for as little as $10,000, you can get access to this huge repository of earnings information. It's a pretty good deal, especially when you can make $300,000 in one of those transactions. And one of these traders actually got access to some information. There was two folks that started on this, and then they started getting other people involved. But then they got greedy, right? They targeted another firm called PR Newswire. This group had a little bit more tighter security. They actually threw these guys out 3 times. The first time they got in, they didn't attack. The second time, they actually installed malware on a system, and they were able to exfiltrate data that way. And that was identified, and then they lost access. This was over the course of several years. They lost access, and then one of the guys actually bought, on the darknet, they bought a bunch of social media logins, a huge repository of it, and then it just happened to be that some of the login credentials that people were using for social media, they're using the same accounts for their admin accounts here. Right. I know that never happens in real life, right? So, and then another one they did with Business Wire. And this one, they actually bought access from a hacker who was advertising. He told them, hey, I've already gotten inside here. I don't want to get involved with selling this information. You guys obviously already have customers. So they just sold access directly, right? So this is becoming a pretty big business enterprise, right? They're making quite a bit of money from this. They've got lots of customers. They even have awesome customer service, because one of the pieces of evidence that was used against them is they actually created a video showing customers how to go about actually accessing this information on their repository. So the traders were actually, they opened up several different trade accounts like in Fidelity. So all these different companies were actually involved in the trade. They even were creating shell companies to try to hide this as well. So they did a really good job. I mean, the white collar side of this, they really knew what they were doing, the hackers as well. And they made around $30 million. That number has actually changed. One of the guys, he actually, he pled not guilty. He was kind of the mastermind behind all this. And it actually came out that it was over $100 million. And they only recovered $53 million. Also, they made some mistakes, though, too. This thing's not working really well. So some of the IP addresses that they actually went in and they went to the PR Newswire, they luckily had kept their logs. They actually found that one or two of the traders actually set up trading accounts for the hackers that were actually involved in this, right? I think at some point they said, hey, you guys are making all this money, why don't you guys help us? And then what happened is he forgot to change his IP or his VPN login, and he didn't cover his tracks. So there was actually the same IP address was logging into the PR Newswire that was doing the hacking, and it was also logging into some of those trading accounts. And that was another correlation that was actually used against them as evidence. So that's a really good case where sometimes you might have log files. It may not be useful for you now, but it could be useful for FBI or someone else that's conducting an investigation, which could be good or bad, right? So this is sort of some of the transactions that they made. There was, like Caterpillar was one of the big companies that they did this with, but there were over 800 trades that were based on some of those press releases that they had actually made. So you start to see, this is a pretty good day's haul. Right? Why get a real job when you can just, make tons of money just doing stock trades? This is the fellow. He was the former VP at Morgan Stanley, and he made around 17.5. That actually has increased to around like 30 million or so, and he pled not guilty. What's really interesting, though, is after he left Morgan Stanley, he became a pastor, and his congregation actually was trying to do fundraising for him. So this gets really, really weird. And actually, when he pled not guilty, and he was actually in court, and a bunch of his parishioners or whatever, they actually came and were actually trying to help him through this. Do you think he was guilty or not guilty? Yeah, they found him guilty, and he's going to be doing at least like a maximum, I think, is 20 years in prison for his involvement in this. Several other people had pled guilty, and they actually ended up testifying against him. So some of the data sources that are with this, this is where I like to look at this, is what data sources are actually involved. So the online brokerage web servers and application logs was really helpful to have. The bank records, right, being able to have access to that. You can identify, especially some of the folks on the white-collar fraud side, they have access to some of that. I've actually done some things where I've splunked some of that data. I've actually did some investigations, bringing that data in, looking for irregularities. Some business registry data, because they were actually creating a lot of different shell companies. One of them even had it was an ice cream company, and 1 year all of a sudden it became incredibly profitable. The Newswire user authentication and VPN logs. The forensic images from Ermovich computer, that's really what helped drive a lot of this stuff. If he had covered his tracks better, encrypted that, or got rid of those, destroyed the drives, there wouldn't be the evidence against a lot of these folks. There was that video tutorial made by Ermovich on how to actually download those files, right? That was really helpful for the FBI. Some of the tools, compromised credentials. So a lot of these accounts, they didn't have any sort of multi-factor authentication. It was just username and password. That's not good, right? Hopefully that's changing. There was some advanced malware that was involved. There was SQL injection. Definitely lack of appropriate logging in one of the Newswires. If they would have been looking for some of those irregularities, maybe the other two might have not gotten popped. And then, of course, Tor and proxies. Right? If you see someone logging into Tor and accessing your server, that's pretty easy to do nowadays. That's maybe something you want to pay attention to. Maybe they're just trying to protect their privacy, but if they're accessing like a brokerage firm or something like that, I'm thinking like 99% of the time that's going to be some sort of criminal activity. Another firm was actually targeting, another type of attack was targeting legal firms. These guys were in China. This guy, Yihong, Zhang, Hongchen, these were the hackers. They even had a whole business plan around it. They had PowerPoint decks of how they're going to go about doing this. So again, that's really useful evidence when you're going through this process, right? So around July 31st, they targeted their first law firm. It was a New York law firm. In some of the criminal complaints, the law firms were able to mask who it actually was, so I don't know specifically what they were. I have some guesses, but they're pretty heavy hitters. And then they were able to download some information. And this is where they're actually looking for data that's tied around mergers and acquisitions, right? So we've gone from PR and earnings, now we're looking at mergers and acquisitions, so that's another piece of valuable data. So they actually looked at, so there was the Roche acquisition of Intermune, Intel's acquisition of Altera, and then they were actually trading on information that they discovered. They targeted a second law firm, and this one, they looked at the Pitney Bowes acquisition of Border Free. And these guys generated around $3 million in funds. Again, that's a pretty good day's work, right? And these are what they actually ended up making. So each of these guys made over, a few of them made almost $1 million, a few of them $500,000. They had to pay all of this back. There was actually, if you guys, I'm not sure if you guys remember this, it was Fin4. There was actually FireEye actually did a really cool write-up on this. These guys were actually targeting primarily like pharmaceutical companies, and they were doing spear phishing campaigns. They were actually trying to get in so they can monitor email in the companies, right? They're not necessarily exfiltrating any sort of data. What they just want to do is monitor, and they're looking for anything that would be useful for trading, be it M&A type of activity and things like that. And they actually sent a request to reach details to at least 8 companies. Some of those companies didn't know they were compromised, right? And then the SEC is now involved. And they actually found that some of those companies didn't have proper security controls in place. So there can be some legal results of that. SEC wasn't, they're not invulnerable either. Some brazen hackers actually access the Edgar database. This is where companies actually upload a lot of company filing information and things like that. They got compromised, but there wasn't a lot of information about this. They know that information was exposed, but they didn't go into any other detail about how that information might have been used. They were monitoring. They're looking for people that might be trading on that particular information. But again, that type of activity can be really difficult to identify between illegal versus illegal versus illegal trade. You really have to be able to dig deeper into that, especially if they're really smart and know how they're doing it. You can do it in smaller transactions, right? And you can go under the radar. So I've dug pretty deep in some of the in the dark web, looking at some of these services that we're offering insider information. There's several forums where you can actually, if you provide insider information, they'll make you a member. And then you can start to actually trade on that information as well. So I'm not going to give you guys the URLs for these, so I don't want to get in trouble. This was interesting. There was a forum. He's actually talking about, he actually works for a major Wall Street company, does millions of trades a day. He has access to a bunch of information around some of this stuff. And he was even saying that, hey, I'll give you this information. We'll do it 50-50. I'll give you hard cash or Bitcoin, and he'll make sure that there's no paper trail. Right? This website, there was, I'm not sure if this was real or not. Again, this one is where you actually have to provide them insider information to actually become a member. And I'm not sure if this is either it's real or it could be the SEC and law enforcement trying to get people. So I did not submit anything, not even fake stuff. So I'm just telling you. So a lot of the trading firms, they do a lot to monitor traders, right? So I was actually talking to one particular company that does this, and they go, yeah, we monitor every phone call. They monitor Skype. They're monitoring all these types of things because they want to make sure that they're not doing any sort of insider trading because that can be a huge fine for them. It can put them out of business. But what's interesting is that they don't necessarily monitor what they're doing when they go home. Right? So if someone has access to some of that information, that's really easy for them to either use an encrypted chat app, go into Tor. There's also the good old paper route, right? Just writing a note on a piece of paper. And that's actually what happened in this next case. There was a fellow, he worked at Bank of America, and he worked in IT, and he had access to a bunch of information. His name was Daniel Rivas. So he had access to these kind of big file shares that were dealing with mergers and acquisitions of companies. And what happened was he just would write these little notes to his girlfriend at the time. They would be love notes, but in those love notes would be communication about a particular stock. He would say, he would have a way of putting the name of the company or the stock ticker, and then also some pricing information as well. So he made them look like they were these sort of paper love letters, She would then hand them off to her father, who would then, he also ended up sharing some of that information over time with other people that were involved. And then he got a little dumb. He had one friend that was having some financial difficulties. So he started giving some of that information to him. And they were using an encrypted chat app, right, that would actually destroy, or supposed to destroy, messages. That's if the other person deletes it, right? So he would delete them on his phone, but some of his friends weren't so smart, and they still had them on the phone when the law enforcement came. So on that particular case, so there was a lot of different types of organizations that are getting targeted for this type of information. So the data we want to go after, if you're a hacker, you want to go look at for earnings reports, patent information. I've seen some cases with that. So if you're a legal firm, you're working with patents. If you know that someone's going to get a patent approved or not, that can be incredibly valuable information because that's going to have an impact on the stock. Any sort of M&A activity, FDA status, right? So that can be a big deal if someone's going to, if maybe a drug isn't going to be approved for whatever reason. That usually has a huge impact. Any sort of pharmaceutical company, that's going to, if you can short the stock, what have you. I believe that vulnerabilities as well can be an issue, or if there is a breach. If I know that a company was breached before anyone else and I can trade on that information, I think there have been some cases of that where organizations where they have been breached and those people actually did trade. They knew that information was going to go public at some point, and so you made money that way. Manufacturing yields. So even looking at a factory and like ICS and even like SCADA types of systems, right? If I can identify maybe a secret formula or I know how much product they're making, I can then make an assumption around how much revenue they may have over the next quarter. So intellectual property, any sort of formulas. So organizations that are going to get targeted are going to be legal firms, M&A firms, PR firms, investor relations firms, a factory, any sort of incident response, and of course, company, HR, legal, and IT. So again, there's a lot of different organizations that can be targeted, but you see that the companies themselves may not necessarily be targeted in this case. It's going to be your service providers. So one thing you want to think about in your risk assessments is what type of information, anything here, are we sharing with maybe our PR firm, our legal firm, what do they have access to? Then we can actually start to ask them questions about how they're protecting that information. And hopefully when you show them this deck, you can show them why you care about that. So some of the tools you want to look for, a lot of endpoint monitoring. I'm always frustrated when I go in and people say, yeah, we're monitoring endpoints, but they're just getting regular Windows event logs. You need to get a little bit more fidelity, especially when you're doing malware investigations. Sysmon's really great. If you want to open, it's a free tool. There's also OS Query, which is open source. Commercial tools like CrowdStrike, Falcon, Carbon Black, all those types of tools are going to give you a little bit more fidelity. You may not necessarily want to deploy it to every single device in your environment, but maybe some of those critical assets that house some of the sensitive information, that's what we really want to make sure we're monitoring. And for the love of God, multi-factor authentication, please. Looking at data loss prevention, a lot of DLP solutions that are out there. I've even seen people homegrow some of this stuff using like plagiarization software. So you can actually see if any of that data is leaving your organization via email, what have you. Proxy and firewalls can be useful. I do a lot with the Splunk UVA product, looking at user behavior analytics, where you're not just looking at signatures, you're actually baselining behavior of individuals, assets, and applications in your environment, and then you're looking for anything that may stray from that. If all of a sudden someone in my organization maybe accesses a file share that they usually don't access, and it's late in the evening, right, that's something that I may want to pay attention to. It doesn't mean necessarily that they're doing something bad, but it is something that I want to maybe develop a hypothesis around. Doing assessments of your partners, again, so it can be legal and PR. I'm really surprised how many companies don't actually do this. They do a great job of securing their own infrastructure, but they don't ask the right questions when they're looking at their service providers, whether it's a PR firm, your legal firm, anyone maybe that's even handling your HR data, right? You really want to be able to understand how they're securing that particular data. Doing phishing exercises can be helpful, a lot of threat intelligence sharing. If you see that some of those PR firms are all being targeted, right? If they start sharing information about some of these things, hey, we've noticed this suspicious activity. Have you guys been seeing something similar? Here are some of the IP addresses that are associated with this. Maybe if they collaborate a little bit more, they can identify some of these things before law enforcement does. Looking at all the data too, I do a lot with insider threats. So Some of these look familiar. A lot of technical data sources that you may have around your network and about your environment. But there's also a lot of great non-technical data sources that can come from HR and from other organizations within your company. I do a lot around insider threat. I like kill chains. You guys are probably familiar with the Lockheed Martin kill chain. So this is an insider threat kill chain. I actually stole it from a fellow at the FBI. They actually leverage this for conducting their own insider investigations for FBI agents when they're actually looking into them. But there's things you can look for. If you know that someone is having financial difficulties, for example, that can be an indicator of someone we may want to have more verbose logging. Again, it doesn't mean that they're doing something malicious or illegal, but depending on your industry and what you're doing, you may want to monitor that a little bit more closely. There's things you can do on the search and recon, looking at more technical data sources usually. If someone's going to break bad, as I refer to it, they usually probe first. They usually see what they have access to. They try to identify what data they can actually get into. And then you'll actually start to see the acquisition and collection of that particular data. And then there's the exfiltration or damage to systems. So again, there's non-technical indicators. This is kind of where you'd be able to start to actually look for indicators there. This can also leverage a lot of UBA. If you use machine learning, things like that, you can start to identify things that are suspicious. And then you're going to have the technical indicators, right? Those are things that we're probably more familiar with and with our traditional security data sources. I'm doing more research on this. There's quite a bit more to this that's coming. I'm digging into some other where there actually have been cases where there's a breach and we're actually seeing the hackers trading on that, knowing that the breach is going to be notified. There's also a concern now too, is if someone identifies a zero-day vulnerability and they know that they're going to announce that at a certain point and they share that with someone and they trade on that information, that can still also be considered insider trading as well, or outsider trading. So if you guys have any questions, ideas, or stock tips, feel free to reach out to me. Splunk, we're actually going to be sponsoring a happy hour from 5 to 7. It's going to be over at Nest. So if you guys want to talk to me more about this and you want to maybe, again, we can talk about stocks, more than happy to stick around. So thank you so much.